Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Do It Right, Make It Better, Enhancing Your Annual Virtual Meetings, presented by Cooperator Events and sponsored by Zarnowski and Beer, LLP. Today, we're happy to welcome our expert panelists, Stephen Beer and Avi Zanjirian. Stephen is a partner with Zarnowski and Beer, practicing exclusively in the cooperative and condominium area. An established industry author and lecturer, he's served on the New York State Society of Certified Public Accountants Real Estate Committee and the Queensborough President's Task Force on Cooperatives and Condominiums. Avi is also a partner with the firm, focusing his efforts on building and securing clientele, as well as developing technology and operational efficiencies for C&B that allow the firm to focus on the big picture when guiding client communities through the audit process. Our moderator today is Alan Stransky, published novelist and staff reporter for Cooperator News, who is himself a co-op shareholder and brings many years of professional experience in residential real estate and finance to our conversation. Audience members, kindly direct your attention to the row of buttons at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Contact information for today's panel can be found by clicking the chat button. However, to submit a question during the discussion, please use the Q&A button only. Questions posted with the chat button will not be answered. While we may not be able to address every question submitted today, we'll do our best to cover as many as possible in the time we have. You're welcome to include your name and location in your question or to remain anonymous. Please also be advised that the views and opinions expressed in today's discussion are those of the panelists themselves and do not necessarily reflect those of Cooperator Events or its parent company, Yale Robbins Publications. All information, content, and materials presented in this webinar are for general informational purposes only and are not intended to constitute formal legal or financial advice. Again, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And without further ado, we turn the floor over to our panelists and moderator.
Good afternoon. Nice to see you again, fellas. Let's get started right away. Clearly, in the past year, co-op and condominium communities have had to adjust to the realities of living in the co-op-19 world. Perhaps the most affected area by these restrictions is caused by the virus is the requirement for communities to hold annual meetings. For the most part, these meetings have moved to Zoom, which I think you would probably agree with that statement. What have we learned, Stephen? What have we learned over the past year about pre-annual meeting prep for virtual meetings, and how does that differ from what we did before for in-person meetings? Also, what things are unique to prepping for an annual meeting on Zoom in particular, and how should they be executed?
So a preparation is key to a successful program. You want to make sure that you use an experienced host who knows their way around Zoom. That really brings it all together. Being prepared with a detailed action plan, a strategy, an agenda, and or a talking script help to be sure that everything flows smoothly. That's all worked so well for so many meetings. It's good to also have a technical coordinator who's behind the scenes to make sure that things go well and handles anything that's happening that would distract the host. Getting the questions in advance of a meeting can be vital. It's so important to allow that to be set up and then give them, let's say, to the professionals to make sure that the meeting gets run totally effectively. I know that people like to hear from the candidates that night during the meeting, but really it's better to have a separate meet the candidate type session that just does that, and then it just be the business of the day on the annual meeting. It's important to ask in advance the attorney to make sure that a virtual meeting is allowed by the bylaws. You don't want that to be an issue. And really planning and discussing for what type of format you're going to use. Most of your options for Zoom are either an open meeting or a webinar, and how you're going to handle the questions and what the voting process is, and having that all ready to go. It's worked the best to have attendees muted unless there's a reason for them to speak, but you really need to make that decision as part of your prepping for the meeting. Technology issues can be a problem. Sometimes it could even affect the professionals. So you want to make sure that everybody's ready. You've either planned or you make sure that they're aid and ready to go. Most of the property managers and board members know who the people in the building are who potentially are going to have an issue. So it's really pretty easy to handle that one. Get started early, the board be there half an hour, 15 minutes before the meeting if you're experienced at this, but it's really important to get together. Things come up. If you don't prep there, you're going to have an issue. And then, sending virtual invitations containing the required link and access information, and making sure everybody can use whatever technology they have, whether that's an iPad, whether that's just phoning in, whether make sure that they all have access. That's what we really learned, what's important in the prep.
That's very, very interesting. I mean, I have a couple of very quick follow-up questions with regard to that. You mentioned having 2 sessions. So that's really interesting. That hasn't caused any kind of sort of kickback from, shareholders or owners at this point, that they have to do 2 of these instead of 1 so that they can hear a candidate forum beforehand? Or is it standard to have a candidate forum beforehand in terms of in-person meetings?
It's not totally standard, but a lot of people really don't necessarily need that piece of it. They know the people in the building. They're not, they don't want to hear it, or some do. So it's just a manner of doing it that makes it work better. So I haven't had any kickback in the cases where I know that they had the 2 meetings. Communication is key to these entities. Any chance the board has to have more communication is looked upon as a positive. It always, as long as it's done professionally.
That's very interesting. Avi, is there a standard set or checklist for evaluating a co-op's annual meeting to make sure that the board is following best practices? How would one go about that?
Sure. So I don't think there's a standard set of checklists. So we've actually prepared something that we wanted to pull up on the screen that kind of just breaks down, similar to what Stephen just went through, how to look at it, how a board should look at it. You're not going to just show up the day of the meeting and say, hey, everybody, let's have an annual meeting. You're going to want to break it down into these steps. And depending on the size of your building, maybe you'll be able to cut out some of these steps. But the first step is planning. We want to plan that. How are we doing it? Like Stephen said, what model are we doing to? Are we not doing to? Practice. We've had buildings, bigger buildings as well, that have done multiple practice sessions where they've gone through the meeting. Does everyone know how to use Zoom that's on the board? Can you share your screen? Can you click through your slideshow? All that stuff. Can we even get on in the first place? Voting, another thing, decide how are you going to do the voting? Are you going to do it in person? Are you going to do it electronically? You can use an outside service. And then after you've been through that stage, evaluate and replan. Again, a bigger building might need that extra replanning step and saying, all right, how did the dry rehearsal go? Are we happy with a company we used for the voting? Get to our final preparation stages before, like a week out before the meeting. The day of the meeting also is important. Like Stephen said, getting on early, making sure that everyone's reminded of the meeting. And then lastly, looking at it from a post-meeting activities, how did we do? Offer open communication with the shareholders or the unit owners. How was it? Did you like it? Was it better? Was it efficient? Do you want to go forward this? Do you want to do it this way going forward? Or any criticism or constructively? So these are kind of the ways we've broken it up. We actually will be sharing at the end detailed steps for each of these bullet points at the end of the session. So that would be our way of saying this is how you should follow it.
All right, thank you. That's terrific. Stephen, along with what we were discussing, in the normal circumstances, there's lots of papers that get handed out at annual meetings, and also that get distributed prior to annual meetings. In terms of virtual meetings, how are documents delivered to shareholders and owners? And is there any requirement that they must be? Is there any requirement that they must be in paper or electronic?
So the only requirements that really exist are in the offering plan that as to what the detail was. I know Avi has a lot of experience dealing with some of this stuff. So why don't I turn it over to him?
Great. Avi, please.
Thanks. No, sure. So it's actually interesting sending out, you're talking about documentation delivery. And obviously everyone's trying to go into a paperless work environment and life. But there is actually still a requirement to send out a notice of meeting through paper mail. What's happening is buildings are doing that, but then saying, okay, we're going to send you out a paper mailing because that's required, but everything else is being done electronically, and that's what's that's it's saying not to circumvent what's required, but to kind of say we understand that mail is required, which I think they're working to change, but everyone has an email address and everyone has access for the most part to a way of getting it that way, and then this way they get the notice of the meeting, they potentially get the candidates night, they get the link. And this way, if it's done all electronically, there's a better chance of more participation happening. So even though, yes, there's a requirement to do it via paper mail, most boards are just doing that as a requirement, but then also moving to a building link mailer, or if there's a Google group or whatever they have, depending on the size of the building.
Got it. Thank you very much. All right. So with that said, when you're holding your meeting on Zoom, what type of meeting should you hold? A webinar or a regular Zoom meeting, and why? Should you choose different formats for annual meetings versus monthly board meetings, and why? And what are the advantages and disadvantages of both?
So we'll start with the annual meetings because I think that's our topic today. But there's actually, I think it depends. To answer the question, it depends on the size of your building. So what we're doing right now is a Zoom webinar. So you cannot, it looks like there's about 134 participants that are on, but we can't, they can't see each other. We can see their names potentially, but we can't see them. Can't hear from them. And it kind of, it projects in a webinar. You're at a seminar, listening to panelists speak and present. So I think when a building reaches, I find that 100 units, if you have 100 units and over, the best way to go about it would be to do a webinar Zoom. Obviously that requires a higher licensing within Zoom, but I think a lot of the managing agents these days have accounts that they can use to create that webinar. And the advantages there you have is that everyone sees who they need to see. So they see everyone that is speaking. So that's going to be your board members, your managing agent, your auditor. If you're going to have your attorney there, he's making a presentation, and any other engineers you may having for a special presentation. This way they see those people. They're not looking at little boxes, and it goes very well. It also controls, like Stephen was saying before, the muting. Everyone doesn't have the opportunity to interrupt one another, and I think those go smoother. Once you have a smaller building, let's say 25 units, 30, even up to 100 units, where you're not expecting everyone to participate, people want to see each other. They're not saying that in a building over 100 units they don't want to see each other, but you're limited on the amount of screens you could see in Zoom. So I think going in a smaller building to a regular Zoom meeting with the right credentials, setting up who could talk, and whether or not you have a waiting room, and making sure you check everybody in, those nuances work really well. In terms of monthly board meetings, I've spoken to a bunch of managing agents, spoken to board members. They've been working much better with Zoom, a regular one, not a webinar. You don't need a webinar for that. And I've also found that they're telling me they're meeting more often. And they can have meetings when they need to because they don't have to coordinate everyone being in the building at the same time. So I think to answer that, it depends on the size of your building, and annual meetings are really webinar for bigger ones.
Along that line, I'm curious very quickly. So let's say you have a building where there's 7 board members, and then you have, the attorney, and you have the accountant, and you may have a couple other people. Should all of these people be visible to the entire audience? And B, does the technology provide enough in, say, a webinar format to have that many people visible together on the screen, or does it become distracting?
So you can, in that environment, you can pick who gets, I mean, you could have everyone as a panelist, but then only show certain people on the webinar.
Okay.
which I think is maybe what's happening right now as well, but I'm not sure.
Uh,
There might be other people behind the scenes that you don't see, even though they are panelists, and you have that opportunity. And I've been on Zoom. I've also been on webinars. I've been on Zoom webinars for buildings with 100 units. 10 people show up.
Right.
That of those 10 people, 8 of them are board members. So you have it's all panelists, and then you have two shareholders are trying to talk, but they can't because whatever it is. So you have to choose, I'm telling you 100 units, expecting 100 people to show up. So that's
Right.
that would be the technicality there. Yeah.
All right. So clearly, uh, Zoom has become, a way of life. Are Zoom meetings here to stay? And for those who don't like Zoom for whatever reason, are there alternative platforms or apps to use? What are they, and how do they differ from Zoom?
Sure. There are definitely a lot of other options out there. So in terms of going back to the board meetings, a regular board meeting that you're having. I mean, my goal in life with a lot of technology is what's the simplest way to get on. I had been using Zoom before the pandemic in our office when we had our own internal training sessions, because I found it the easiest. There was no barriers to entry. You click on the link, you're in the meeting. Another similar software that's like that is Google Meet. And they've developed that. It used to be called Google, not Chat. It was another name too, but now it's called Google Meet, MEET. And that also could be an instant meeting, no downloading. You don't have to download and ask for permissions from your IT, and you get right into the meeting, and it's quick. It has a lot of the features that are with Zoom, but not like all the detailed features but you have to remember that right now this is what's available. There's also Teams, Microsoft Teams, which we use internally at our office. I found that when I try bringing a client in on a Teams meeting, they always have a problem getting in. So I don't know how user friendly it is if it's outside of your environment. There's also WebEx. WebEx has been around for a long time. That works well as well. I have nothing against any of these companies, but WebEx works. And there's also GoToMeeting. So they're all options that are out there. The reason I think Zoom has been at the forefront is that they keep developing the software. They're adding all these features to kind of listening to the users, and the waiting room and the muting and the recording and all that stuff is just so intuitive. It helps that I think they're here. I wouldn't be surprised that in 2 years from now you ask me that question, someone else maybe has the market share. They develop something that's better. That's just the way technology works. But today, I think Zoom's here, and I think these meetings, to answer your question, are they here to stay? I think I found that I've spoken to my clients more often and in video conference more than I have in the past, because it's just the availability. Let's talk. Let's have a meeting. We don't have to set up a meeting. And do I come to the building and come to the basement, come to your apartment, meet in my office? It's like, all right, can you meet in like an hour? Meet in an hour. We're on a Zoom. We all have what we're looking at. And it's also easy if, from an annual board meeting perspective, a lot of times, the board member will ask a question to the managing agent. Hey, do you have this invoice, or do you have that? Oh, it's in the office. I'll get it to you tomorrow. When you're in a Zoom environment, you could say, or go on to the next thing. I'll look for it. I have it on my computer, and we'll pop it up and look at it together. Meetings end up being a little bit more efficient that way. So it might end up being that's what, for regular monthly meetings, that's where people go towards.
That's very interesting. I've sort of had the same experience that there's a lot more direct contact on a more spontaneous basis with Zoom, because you don't have to plan the visit to someone's office.
Correct.
With that said, I have a question from someone in the audience, from Lewis in Peekskill, who wants to understand something about the nomination process for board elections. So he says, is the nomination process for board elections completed before the meeting, or are nominations from the floor during the meeting required or accepted? So the question is really, how does conducting a virtual meeting affect this? And our bylaw, he says that his bylaws are silent on the topic of board nominations, and there are differing opinions about how they should be running them. So what are your thoughts on this process?
So I was about to answer, look at your bylaws, because a lot of times the bylaws have a paragraph how to run the nominations, which is you have to have a nomination committee, and they get all the nominations. So if it's silent, It's actually, I think, better where we are now, where you could kind of decide how you want to go about it from a virtual perspective. So going back to his first question, I think it was about nominations from the floor. I don't think nominations from the floor are required unless it says in the bylaws that it has to be. I think most of our buildings have been actually moving away from allowing that, but communicating that and sending out in advance of the save the date for the annual meeting, or sending a save the date before the official notice of meeting, saying we're going to have our meeting on this date or around this date. Here are the candidates that are up for or running. If you'd like to, run for the board, please let us know by a certain date, and we will not be accepting nominations on the floor. And I think that that really changes the like the whole process of the voting, because now you don't have to change the ballots the night of the meeting and add on the people's names who are now running from the floor. You give everyone, as long as you give them enough notice, and again, as long as your bylaws allow this, it might be that you have no choice and you have to follow it, which is then you go to have the discussion of maybe changing that with everything that's going on, and make sure that you get everyone in advance. And this way, like Stephen was saying, you have the opportunity to have a meeting of all the candidates in advance. That meeting will only be 20 minutes. Everyone gets 5 minutes. There's 4 candidates and we're done. As opposed to, sticking that into a already elongated annual meeting schedule and and getting everyone there. And this way you can meet those candidates. If you don't like who's running, you can nominate yourself or nominate somebody else before the date that is set. And then you have all your nominations, your ballots are all set. So when you get to the voting on the night of the meeting or the proxies, you know who's running, and there's no questions and no considerations for that.
Actually, thank you. That's very informative. All right, so I'd like to move on to another subject. Stephen, what are the benefits of holding your meeting virtually as opposed to in person? And are there long-term versus short-term benefits, and why? Overall, should boards consider returning to in-person meetings when the pandemic ends? Why not? Or should maybe there be some kind of hybrid situation?
So, this has really worked out very, very well. And I want to break up my answer into a few pieces. So to me, the camaraderie of the people who were living together in the building and having the annual meeting and getting together is vital to the whole mission of a co-op or a condo, and it gets achieved really well here. And then the benefit from that is you don't have to incur cost to rent a room. You don't have to adapt space around. You have to spend the whole day trying to set up whatever room it is so that you can have the annual meeting, and then potentially not everybody shows up anyway. So that's really one of the ones that right off the top says, this is doing the same thing that we were doing before. I've seen in cases where when they needed to set up the room or rent a room, they had to have an AV charge for the board to put up some kind of document, PowerPoint or whatever they needed to show. An architect was coming to give some details about major work that was being done, and it would need to be, put up onto the screen. With the virtual meeting and on Zoom, it just can be popped up. It's in front of everybody. It's quite clear. Most of the time for us as professionals, when we do try to do a financial report of the condition of the property, we end up having to ask, does anybody want paper copies if we're at a physical meeting before we talk, in case they want to go through it? Then probably 50% of the questions are, what page are you on when you're going through it? Here, if we want to display it, it's up on the screen. We're talking about the one, and the nice thing is we can roll back to the question that comes up later about something we already talked about and we thought we moved on. So it really keeps everybody's attention, everyone in the right place. So if these are here to stay, it would be the best thing, I think, for everybody. There really hasn't been a total commitment to say which way it's going to be. Different boards have different opinions as to what they think it is. I think cost is an issue. So cost is more likely to make them virtual. And I think, the type of building it is, if it's a small building, there's a great space in the building to do it. And for whatever reason, the people don't get together that much, they see this as an opportunity together, it's more likely that they potentially will go back to physical. And then on the physical side, so in the short term, obviously, we're benefiting from the physical distancing that we needed to do, for the past year. That's starting to hopefully break up now as we become more of the vaccinated society. But we're also finding it works better into everybody's schedule. There were times where we had meetings where we had physical meetings, we had to wait for somebody who got held up on the subway or got held up at work, where, maybe they are held up, but it's definitely doesn't include travel time to get back to the property. On the long-term benefit, the attendees no longer have to be at the property. If they've moved out of the building and they're subletting, they can still attend. People can find 20 minutes or a half an hour to do a virtual meeting, where if they had to travel an hour to get to the meeting and go home, it's a 3-hour endeavor. So these are all long-term benefits. Us as professionals, other professionals, the property managers, we're all really busy. We don't need to travel. We don't need to spend the time on that. Costs are saved for the professionals in that way. It makes it really easy for everybody to attend. People are out of town on business, they can still attend the meeting if it's virtual. As I said before, the whole meeting gets enhanced by having the option of putting things on, keeping everything on topic, that people are not speaking out. I mean, I know everybody needs to be heard, but it definitely is one of the long-term benefits. And, a vote tallying and for the process is really a better process. It's getting done with a technology, or it's being done in the background. It's not sitting around a table at the back of the meeting trying to count ballots. It gets done effectively and efficiently. So to me, these are all the long-term benefits that are there for these types of meetings. And personally, I really hope that they continue, and I ask all my clients to continue doing it.
That's interesting. So in a way, the shift to Zoom is kind of the silver lining on the COVID cloud for co-ops and condos. It may turn out to be that way.
Absolutely.
Amen.
Absolutely. And believe it or not, costs were down on a lot of the budgets, and real estate taxes probably are coming down for the co-op. So those are the ones that are also out there, but it's amazing that there's a silver lining to all this.
Well, that's a good thing. Avi, along that line, how can boards and management accommodate members or shareholders who cannot or choose not to participate in virtual meetings? What are they obligated to do? And what about people who have physical challenges, versus those who just refuse to adjust to whatever the new reality is? There are some people who can't get there, and
Right.
there are others who say, I'm not going to because I'm not going to participate in this. So how should that be? What are your thoughts, and how should that be handled?
So, first things first, any of these platforms, Zoom, Teams, I can Google as well, offer a call-in option. So if anyone's going to say, I don't have an iPad, I don't have a laptop, I don't have a computer, I don't have a smartphone, you have a phone, I hope, and you could call in. So then you might ask the question, well, I can't see what you're showing on the screen. Fair and valid points. So I would recommend if a lot of times the financial statements are sent in advance, but if you're making a presentation and it might be tweaked up right before the meeting, if that person lives in the building, 3:00 in the afternoon, print a copy, bring it to that person or multiple people and say, here, this is our agenda, this is what we're going to talk about. And we know that the engineer is making a report, this person will bring you all the paper, you could look at it while you're listening. Then again, this is, I think, more of if this continues while people are more vaccinated and safer, you can send a volunteer to their apartment or to their home and say, hey, let's practice running through a Zoom. And this is, we're running it through Zoom. We'll make a fake Zoom right now. You get it, you get in, maybe the building wants to buy a laptop or an iPad, or management has one to lend, and say, well, you could use it this way and we'll help you go through it. If you still have a problem with that, I think, as long as they're comfortable with it, maybe you have somebody watch the Zoom with them in their apartment, so this way they could go through it together. I think those are the best options you have for somebody that doesn't want to get there. Because of the governor's order that allows virtual shareholder meetings, there's nothing that the building's obligated to do further than that. From my understanding, the legislation's out there to make that a permanent change, that all corporation shareholder meetings can be done via any electronic means, phone or Zoom or video conferencing. So those are the ideas I can think of that could help somebody get to the meeting if they don't want to, or if they can't.
Okay. All right. So we've got a bunch of questions coming in right now from the audience. I first want to sort of just go back to something you were talking about a little more specifically, and this
Sure.
was submitted by Dana in the Bronx, which is in their building, they have a lot of people who, for whatever reason, don't have internet service. So is there a best way to ensure that these people's opinions and questions are addressed and that their proxy votes are counted that evening? What can be suggested to make them comfortable if it's going to be, a phone thing for them and they can't interact directly?
Sure. So I think, well, I guess there's two pieces. There's the proxies and there's the questions. So I think that something you'll see in our action plan, but something Stephen spoke about as well before, is that, and I've had buildings that have done this even before COVID, really emphasizing to ask your questions in advance, that we will only accept questions in advance. So this way we have the boards have the time. If it's a question for the accountant, they could send it to the accountant in advance. If it's a question for the attorney, they could send it to them in advance. If it's a question for the board that they need to look into, they could answer those questions and be prepared for them at the time of the meeting. And so if somebody can get onto a Zoom, or they can only get on a phone call, or the board's not taking questions from the floor, or they're not able to, right? They can't get it that way. Send your question in advance to the board or to management. This way they could address it for you. And if you're not going to be there at the meeting, you could work out with them that they'll send you the answer before the meeting happens or after the meeting happens. I think that's the best way to get about answering questions for people that have opinions that maybe can't get on an online meeting, but can only call and don't know how to unmute themselves. In terms of the proxies, I mean, the proxies are no different than as long as the board sets it up this way, that you can mail it a proxy like you would be in pre-COVID, pre-virtual meetings. So that I think is that's a simple solution. They don't have to email it; they can mail it. And if the proxies are sent out in advance, they'll mail it in. It's postmarked, and it has to be accepted for that. So
Okay. Sort of like voting nationally in
exactly.
a presidential election. So with that said, we have two questions that just came in. One quickly, I guess, Avi, this is probably best for you. In a webinar, how do you verify that you've got a quorum?
Oh, it's an interesting question. So there's a couple of ways to do it. I found we actually help some buildings run their annual meetings at our firm, and I found that there's two ways that you could do that. Number one is, you, like Stephen said, you have somebody, a technical advisor or someone, the assistant property manager, looking through the chat. I'm sorry, the participants list on Zoom or whatever mode they're using, and make sure everyone's in there. Now, the problem is, you might ask, well, what if someone comes in as, iPhone 5 or iPhone 6 or their phone number? So what I've seen done, and I think it's worked very well, is if you're going to invoke the waiting room through Zoom, which is a feature, so you only let somebody in when you admit them, that you admit one person or two people at a time, and when they get in, you ask them to change their name, or say, announce yourself. Who are you? Are you from 2A, 1B, John Doe, and John Smith? And this way they could change their name on their screen, just like we have right here. It says Avi Zangerian. They would change it to their name and their apartment number, and they could take a quorum that way. So that's one way. If you have a very big building and that's not doable, you could also do registration with Zoom in advance. And this way you get a registration list in advance, and then you could check off who attended to get a quorum. And the other way to do a quorum would be the same way with proxies. If you send out proxies in advance and they're mailed in, even if the person's not in attendance at the Zoom, that proxy counts towards a quorum.
Got it.
So there's a couple different ways.
Okay, that's very informative. So we just have another question related to this from Kevin, which I'm just going to hold in abeyance until we get, because I want to do a more general question first, which is, in voting in general, what should boards and managers, what do they need to know about proxy voting and procedures? How much of that is necessary for the individual board members, and how much should be, is really knowledge for the management people or the attorney or the accountant? And could you quickly walk us through what a typical virtual election looks like?
Sure. A typical virtual election is not that much different from a in-person election. And that is a lot of buildings pre-COVID were using what's called a direct proxy ballot. And the direct proxy ballot had on there the candidates or who they're voting for. If there was a special election that evening, they're trying to approve a capital project, or if they were doing some other change to the bylaws, a transfer fee, a flip tax approval, and that direct proxy ballot was sent in advance, can be signed, submitted, and sent in somewhere, which we'll get to. Where does it get sent into before the meeting? And I think that shouldn't change with regards to a virtual annual meeting. I think when the meeting notice goes out, the proxies are sent out. If you're doing what we said before, which is not taking nominations from the floor, those ballots will be the official ballots with all the candidates, and there won't be adding on anyone else. So what I've been seeing, and I think recommending also, is that you either can mail in those proxies, or you could create a special email address, which is controlled by certain people, whether it's someone on the board, whether it's someone from management, whether you hire someone else from the outside to be that person. And you call it vote@abccoop.com, and you could email your proxy to that number, or you could even go type an email message saying, "Hi, I'm from 2A, I'm voting for X, Y, and Z," and send that email out. And I think those are the methodologies that are best used. People have suggested using the chat function to vote. I think those were in the early on. I don't recommend that, because then you have to go through the chats and weed through the questions and all the commentary that goes on with there, and then see who they voted for. So I don't recommend that. Another option that I've seen is that you could also text your answer. They come up with a generic number through a service. You could text your vote and your proxy to that number. It gets tabulated that way. I think as long as you follow those procedures, then the voting will really kind of happen the same way it had before. And then it's important that the last thing is, we didn't get to this, is how do you tabulate them, which is finding the right inspectors of election. So whether that's, I know we at our firm, we do about 3 or 4 elections a year. We're hired by our clients to do that. People are using Honest Ballot. There's another website called Election Buddy, which is used as well. And those are other ways you could securely get those tabulated, same way you would do it if it wasn't, virtually.
Okay, and just as a very quick follow-up to that, we had this question from Kevin, which was specifically about counting ballots, because his question is how to protect secret ballots at a virtual meeting. So you've talked about a lot of options that are electronic options, other than raising hands or registering their vote on the screen. But along that line, is there any kind of privacy protected way of sending your vote through Zoom directly from your little box to some central spot that is privacy, that does have a privacy and is controlled? Or is that not an option on Zoom?
So through Zoom, you can directly chat somebody. So if you go on to If you go onto Zoom as an attendee, and then that attendee is called voting man or voting woman or voting person, and everyone tells you have to direct chat that person your vote, that could be done privately and securely. I don't recommend it, because if somebody doesn't know how to use that function, or sends it to all the panelists or all the viewers, then it's obviously you're not going to get that done securely. So I would say if there's a concern for security for a special election, you could go back to the old way, which is you set a locked box in the lobby and everyone drops in their ballot there, or create a generic email address that only one person has access to, where everyone sends their vote to, or their special election
Right.
to.
Got it. Okay, so along the lines of how we conduct meetings, we had two questions, one from Raymond in Hollis, another from William in Manhattan, that sort of, they're similar questions relative to outside companies. Could you talk a little bit about outside companies that run and conduct virtual meetings? Can a co-op or a condo choose to do it entirely themselves without, any kind of assistance? And what should people be looking for when they're hiring an election coordination company? And if you know anything about what they charge, please enlighten us.
Sure. So in terms of I think there's two types of services that are out there that we've seen from our clients and just the other research that I've done. So actually, a couple of my clients have used consultants, and if someone wants to chat, I don't want to put their information out there, but if someone wants to chat me privately or email address, I can provide you with that person's information. And they kind of ran the entire meeting. They set up the Zoom. They sent out the registration links. They held all of the pre-meetings, rehearsals. The night of the meeting, they were the technical advisor, and it really went really smoothly. It was a big building, about 350 units. It was done as a webinar, really smooth. All the board members were prepared, and they also did the voting. We did the voting, so the voting went to a special email address, and it went really smoothly. There are also I was actually hired to do a moderator at a co-op condo wasn't one of our properties, because the building felt that if they use the attorney, if they use the accountant, if they use the board members or the management company, there'd be a conflict of interest. So there is the opportunity, if doesn't have to be me, but if you have someone neutral that could be the moderator and present and make sure, and they're also running the Zoom, so this way they can mute people and unmute people, take the questions, run the Q&As behind the scenes. That really helps things move very smoothly. Now, in terms of, can they do it entirely themselves? 100%. A lot of the management companies out there are very well equipped with what they need. They'll set up the Zoom. They'll take care, just like they would in an in-person setting. They'll take care of the voting. They'll assign someone from their office to be the inspectors of election. They'll take the elections, tabulate it, take the Q&A, run the meeting. And I've been on a multitude of meetings run by management companies that have done very well, and they know exactly what they're doing. I've also had boards that someone on the board is very technologically astute and understands Zoom, and they ran the meeting. So it doesn't have to be an outside company. It doesn't have to be management. It can be anyone. Like Stephen was saying, as Stephen was saying before, you just want to make sure you have somebody that understands the software to make sure it runs smoothly. Because if you're presenting, you can't also take care of admitting people from the lobby. So those are things. Now, in terms of what they charge, I know, because I think that was one of the questions you asked. So I know
Yes.
Election Buddy, which is a website. They charge, it's actually interesting, by election. And the pricing that I found was $19 an election, up to 350 voters. So I think the key there is you have to do all of the setup. So you have to go in, enter all the shareholders, their names, their addresses. There's a lot of input, and once you get the data in there, the election itself is very smooth and it's very secure. And you could actually have live. It's an interesting. People should check it out. Honest Ballot's been around for a while. I don't know exactly how much they charge, but I know that one of our buildings use them. They're over 1,000 units. and they paid about $11,000. So figure around $10 per unit. I don't know if that was the basis, but that was how much they paid. And again, like I said, there's some consultants that won't do the voting, but they'll just do the running, the technical advisory of making the meeting run appropriately or correctly.
Thank you, Avi. Stephen, we have a question from Eileen in Massapequa. She says, my last annual board meeting was in October of 2019, with little or no communication since then on what's going on within the community. Should there have been a virtual meeting by now or one held outside? And how can we get our board back on track?
So Eileen, I'm going to venture to say from all the offering plans that I have seen, your board missed your meeting that you were required to have a meeting. At the very least, when all of this was happening just over a year ago or such, there should have been some kind of notification that it's being held off, and they will reorganize when they can. I hope you got a financial statement, that you're getting the financial reports. I hope you got a budget. So if there was an increase or there wasn't an increase, you have an idea where things are going. Unfortunately, you fall into that group of people who are unit owners in buildings who don't get everything they're supposed to, and you have to fight your way through this. Personally, I find the nice approach to start is always the best. So I'm sure you've already asked, but if you haven't, ask, try to get access to board members, that it's not just going to a property manager who may not forward your request. Ask for information. You can share with them. I believe that they're recording this session and that there'll be a link that you can send it to them to say, hey, these things are going on. Everybody's doing it. And our offering plan calls for us to hold a meeting. Other than that, you can talk to your neighbors, and sometimes those things fall on deaf ears. I know in my association of 2,000 units, we've recently had a vote and only 74 people voted. So, apathy is out there. It's not unlikely that you're running into. Those are the best I can offer to you. We've seen buildings go through this before, and just try to spread the word within the building, and hopefully they will wake up that they can't hide from how hard this could be if they tried to do it on their own, and they'll learn things on the way and get you one this year.
So you mentioned recording, and so we have a question from Jeff, who asks, is it wise to record an annual meeting, or should it actually be recorded? Is there any legal issue about that if it's being conducted via Zoom? It could clearly, if it was a live meeting, someone might be taking minutes. So he's curious about the possible legal ramifications of recording. Is it required, illegal? What do you know about it?
So, we're not lawyers. I can't come out and say it's legal or it's not. I can say that if you're going to run this, you should have a copy of it as evidence that you did it. It doesn't necessarily have to be distributed out to people, but it just makes sense to have it show that it happened and to have documentation as to what transpired. So that's my suggestion.
Avi, do you have anything to add to that?
No, the only thing I would add is that as long as you're recording it, I mean, Zoom shows a button, but you just let everybody know that you're recording it. Because I remember there being an instance with one of my clients that I read in the minutes that someone was recording the board meetings, under the table, and I think there was an issue there. So as long as you're recording it, I think there should be advertised to the attendees that that's happening.
Okay, so along that line, we had a very interesting question from Isabel. So clearly there can be technical issues. We know that. It's happened. I disappeared from the screen for about 3 seconds earlier on this webinar. So what if any ramifications are there, legal or otherwise. If someone gets cut off by a Wi-Fi problem or other technical difficulties during one of these meetings, do you have to start it all over again? Does it make it not an official meeting? Do you have any insight onto any of this? Either one of you, both of you.
I would say it's no different if you went to the bathroom in the middle of the meeting. They don't have to stop the meeting for you to stop. It's like my daughter. A lot of times we're having dinner. She says, "Okay, stop talking. I'm going to the bathroom. I don't want to miss any of the conversation." So I just don't see that being a legal something that you could legally uphold. But it'd be interesting to hear differently.
Stephen, any thoughts on that?
I don't have anything to add. Thank you.
Okay, so one other short question. We have a question from Ethan in the Bronx relative to proportional voting. Can you comment on the mechanics of how one would do live proportional voting on Zoom? Avi?
So is this specifically about the proportional that it's, or just in terms of can you do live voting on Zoom? Because I would think that we talked about how to do the live voting on Zoom. I think just using not using Zoom as the platform for it, but allowing voting to happen, allowing voting to happen live, meaning don't accept proxies in advance. But if it's talking about the proportional voting of the calculation of it, I don't see why it would be any different than if you did it, by paper.
Okay, and one last question before we start to sum up. For several people have asked about hybrid Zoom and in-person meetings and how that works. Could you briefly give us some idea about how that would work? And is it something that you think is a good idea, or should you keep away from it?
So I think hybrid meetings are probably, I would keep away from it. And I will bring my children back into this conversation again as an example. For those of you that have children that are in mixed environments with classroom, in classroom learning and half the class on Zoom, the kids that are on Zoom are not actually disregarded, but it's very hard for them to participate the same way when the teacher is live in the room. So the teacher is live in the room, there's live students, and then you have 10 kids that are on Zoom on a screen in the back or even in the front of the room. They're usually all muted because they don't want the feedback noise to interrupt the class. And then there's really nothing that's happening. So in terms of you're looking for an interactive hybrid, it's not a good idea. But if you're setting up the technology, which can be done, where you have a microphone on the speaker in live, and you're going to have all the attendees that are watching from home they're just watching and they can't ask questions and they're just there to watch, then I think that actually can be done. And if the building has the right technology with a nice webcam, with a good microphone, a good internet connection, and 10 people want to be in person and the rest want to be at home watching on Zoom, or the other way around. If there's more people on Zoom and only 10 people want to come live, you could set up a projector, let's say in the wherever they usually meet, the lobby or the laundry room, which is a common place that I've had meetings, and set up the projector for whoever wants to be in person and watch it there. But again, they won't be able to participate. It'll be very hard for them to participate.
Got it. So with that said, I'd like to ask both of you some final thoughts on the subject. Stephen, please give us your thoughts on, sort of how to wrap this up.
So I saw in the questions that there was some feedback when I had said about doing the separate candidate nights, and there was some comments about, could you send out bios? And absolutely, bios work. That's a totally good way to do it. I would shy away from having anything added at the meeting if you send out the bios. These meetings are really good, and just the way this seminar is so professional, even though your cooperator is such a professional provider, still it comes across well, it goes well, it's good for everybody to find time. All of the people who joined us didn't have to travel. We mentioned this before. So I'm hope they're here to stay. And I still believe that allowing corporations to do annual meetings in the state of New York is under the executive order from the governor. One of the questions talked about that it expires at the end of 2021. I'm not familiar with that, but there is the possibility that we're going to go back to the old law and they need to be done physically. I'm hopeful that they're going to find a way that in New York State these will survive the fact that we can't get together.
Thank you. Avi, the final word. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts are that I think there's a lot to digest. We talked about a lot tonight. Today, we talked about voting, we talked about planning, we talked about, avoiding, situations where people can't attend. I think, taking all this information as we're getting into meeting season this year and then every year, I think we just kind of look at all the different things. Everything we talked about might not apply to your building because, you've been doing, or you did it right last year and it really worked. And we'd love to hear about that as well. So I think just taking all this information together, sitting down with your board, figuring out, how you want to do it and moving forward, really would be, I think, helpful to everyone. And I think, like you were saying, the silver lining, if you could say, from such a year, is that I think we could actually, be able to communicate more and be together more, which I'm finding, in our line of business, and even with, family as well, that there's more communication going around. So hopefully we'll be able to keep that going for the future.
I want to thank both of you. This has been incredibly informative, and thank you very much, and thank you to the audience, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, Alan.
This concludes today's discussion. Thank you all again for your participation. We hope you found it interesting and informative. Watch your email in the coming days for a link to today's recording, as well as contact information for our panelists. This webinar will also be available to stream on demand at cooperatoryevents.com. Please feel free to share it and follow us on social media to stay informed about future events.